Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Graduate Student Spotlight. I'm your host Siddharth Arora, and today I have with me Taylor Gregory. Taylor Gregory is a second year MA student at Oklahoma State University. She studies post-secularization, contemporary poetry, and hybridized religious practice to uncover how religiosity materializes in the modern world.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.
And I feel like we should go ahead and acknowledge the fact that Siddharth and I are twinning today.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure if you can really tell in the camera, but we have on pretty similar shades of, I think, purple, but Siddharth says pink. So
Yeah,
it remains a topic of debate.
I would concede to you. Like, I don't know enough about colors to say much about them. I'm just happy that I am wearing something nice and my partner got this for me, and I'm very happy to
Yeah,
be wearing this. Yeah.
very nice. Yeah, it makes
Yeah.
us look like we're a lot more coordinated than we probably were in reality, but
Yeah,
very professional production here.
very professional. Yeah, it's so professional. Yeah, everything is coordinated.
Exactly.
Everything is
Yes.
absolutely.
We didn't have any problem setting up.
No, not
Getting
at all.
started.
Getting started.
No.
I did not fumble a single time reading your fancy words on the paper.
Not one time.
Not one time.
Nope.
No.
I am excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're here. So, to begin with, let's just begin, as they say, at the beginning. So, tell us something about yourself and how about your journey towards becoming a literary scholar?
Yeah, this is always an interesting question. I feel like maybe other people have a bit more exciting journeys to becoming a literary scholar. For myself, from the time I was in fourth grade, I knew that I was going to be in academia in some capacity, though I guess I didn't exactly know what academia was. I knew I wanted to probably teach. I wrote...
Nod alert.
Oh my gosh.
Trust me, Taylor asked me to do that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, we actually have this whole soundboard that I've just discovered. So I told Siddharth to incorporate as many sounds as possible. But yeah, so from the time I was in fourth grade, I had an interest in writing and reading, as I'm sure many of us have. I specifically remember writing a short story for a standardized test where I had to write about a significant place in my life, and I wrote about a creek that was near my house, and that was the first time that I remember really enjoying writing, and I suppose I received some sort of positive feedback on it, but that sort of sent me down this trajectory of getting interested in reading and writing. As I was growing up, I started spending more time writing stories. Again, I feel like this is probably a narrative that every literary scholar has, but I took my mom's old laptop and I would just write stories for days and days. These were like long documents. They were like 50 pages, single space.
Oh, wow.
Which
That's a lot.
I could never do now. I'm no longer in creative writing. I don't have the patience for working on something that long. But yeah, that's really what kickstarted my interest. By the time I was in middle school, I found some online platforms where I could publish stories and created community that way. I would say that the most significant experience that I had that really solidified my interest in academia and literary scholarship was a British literature class that I took as a dual credit student, so college credit, but I was still in high school, so I think I was maybe like 16 at the time. And I actually learned about modernism for the first time, which is still my area of interest, which is very strange, I think, because many people do end up changing their research trajectories. Somehow I've managed to stay within the same period of time, roughly.
Stuck in time.
Yeah, I think it might just be coincidental, but I remember taking that class, learning about modernism and being like so fascinated by it. Specifically just the fact that, as I'm sure many of us know, modernism is really responding to the historical and cultural context of the early 20th century between the two world wars, industrialization, globalization, etc., and the response that was made to all of these events within art and within literature, to me, was so groundbreaking and so different from any other literary periods that I had seen previously. So I was very interested in some of just like the stylistic features that you see in modernist writing, so stream of consciousness, experimental poetry, fragmentation. I read The Wasteland for the first time in that class, and that continues to be perhaps the most influential piece of literature that I've read. In many ways, it really started my trajectory within modernism and continues to influence me today. So all of that to say, I feel like in some ways I always knew that I would be on this particular path, but it is interesting to see how it's evolved and changed to get here.
That is such a beautiful answer. That is so comprehensive and so detailed. Thank you. And I love the fact that like you started with creative writing, and that's how I also did. Like the first poem that I wrote was about a tree.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I still remember, and I must have written something before that.
Yeah.
But it was like that was the moment where it was just like I found pleasure in the act of producing something. And it's such a beautiful feeling. And a lot of times we are told how to differentiate between creative writing, literary studies, but it's just all is very similar in some ways.
Yeah, that's a conversation that you and I have had several times, I know. I think within academia, there is certainly a push, even within graduate programs, to really distinguish yourself as either a literary scholar or a creative writer. And I think we can get so trapped within those distinctions that we don't realize that there often is overlap. Most literary scholars that I know are, in their own time, creative writers. They're poets, they are novelists. And so I am very much in favor of a more holistic view of the discipline, being able to both work on critical pieces and work on creative pieces, and seeing how those two can really inform one another. I know for myself personally, my area of interest, I specifically spend a lot of time looking at poetry, both within modernism and contemporary poetry as well. And while part of that is just because I think poetry in and of itself is an interesting vehicle to talk about some of the topics I'm interested in, I myself am a poet, and I really feel like my creative work informs my critical work as well.
Yeah, that's true. I feel the same way. Like I've been told to keep the two separate.
Yeah.
But for me, I can't do one without the other.
Yeah.
Like it has to happen together. And it all, when I'm reading most of the brilliant theory, that's when I love writing poetry.
Yeah.
It just is a great feeling to engage in these ideas together and not just like separate in my mind the two things. I just can't. It's just not me. Yeah. So tell us something about your journey to coming towards OSU. What brought you to Oklahoma?
So I am a Dallas, Texas native, so I'm only about 4 hours from Oklahoma. Interestingly, the university that I did my undergrad at, this is just like a random liberal arts school in Texas, but there was this pipeline of students who went to my undergrad university to OSU, which,
wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I had like several friends that had gone to OSU and had spoken really highly of it. So when I was doing my master's applications, I definitely had OSU on my list. And when I was accepted, I think more than any other program, everyone at OSU was just very welcoming. They made me feel already as if I was part of the community, which, of course, as a graduate student, that community is so important not only to your scholarship, but also just to your general well-being as a person. And so I really appreciated that sense of community, and I continue to feel that community all of the time while at OSU. I've had so many opportunities, as I know you have as well, to get involved within the department. For me, with the first year composition program, and then for both of us, the Southern Plains Conference. And again, while those are like really great opportunities for professional development, I also feel that it's just a great way to connect with other graduate students and to collaborate. And I feel like those collaborations have made me a better scholar and just a better person generally. But yeah, I think that community aspect really does set OSU apart, and I'm very grateful to have had that experience.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I feel this is something I love about our department. This is absolutely the best place in the sense of how everybody takes care of each other, and specifically the literature department. All our professors are amazing, they're super nice, very accommodating, they're brilliant, they push us to do better work, and but nobody takes anything personally, nobody says anything that would hurt anybody, at least to the students. Everything is just like beautiful to us. And the opportunities that you get, oh my god, it's been one of the best experiences of my life just because of the fact that I have been given so many opportunities, and as you said, like you have been. So it's just a great program in that sense. What about the composition assistant director gig? How is that going for you?
Yeah, to your point, first, I'll say that as someone who was coming from a small university that had limited resources, I was very excited to see how many opportunities were available to me at OSU to get involved. And even just in the realm of coursework and different faculty members, I was very excited by that opportunity. So I think that there's definitely a great balance between a feeling of community within the department, but also having all of the resources and opportunities available that you would expect to have at a university like OSU. Yeah, so speaking to specifically the first year composition program, I will say out of all of the opportunities that I've had at OSU, I really think that teaching composition and now being able to mentor other composition instructors, I think that's been probably the most rewarding experience that I've had so far. Something that I've talked about with colleagues is the fact that when you're starting a graduate program, you may not necessarily know if you have all of the different skill sets that would be involved to have an academic position. You may be somebody who is good at research, but you don't necessarily know if you'll be good at teaching, or perhaps vice versa. And that was certainly the case for me. I knew that I enjoyed reading, I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed scholarship, but I didn't know necessarily if that would translate to a classroom. And I was so happy to find that I really found a lot of fulfillment in working with students, specifically first-year composition students, and really introducing them to the discipline, even if they are not English majors or they ultimately wouldn't become English majors. It was just very fulfilling getting to work with them. And so that was, or has been, the most significant experience that I've had at OSU. So when I had the opportunity to become a mentor as a first-year composition assistant director, I really was excited to take that. I also had a wonderful mentor, Salman.
Oh, yeah. He has mentioned to me several times how Taylor is one of the best instructors he has observed. He has nothing but good things to say about you.
That's so kind. Yeah, he was a wonderful mentor to me, and we are still, of course, in communication. But yeah, that mentorship that I received from Salman was so significant to me that I wanted to be able to share that with incoming instructors and make sure that they were prepared and that they got the same positive experience out of teaching first year composition as I feel like I have. But yeah, all things considered, I feel like it's been a great privilege in order to have a class and to teach students and introduce them to writing, to literature. And out of everything that I've done, I feel like I've enjoyed that the most.
Oh, wow. That's a great answer again. Yeah, you're killing it.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, Taylor, you have mentioned to me, and we have had several discussions about it. So, you grew up interested in religion. Would you like to tell us what led you to study religion, and in particular, why study literature and religion together?
Yeah, so I'll say that initially these were two separate spheres that were major influences in my life, literature and religion, and I hadn't initially conceived of them as converging, and it's really just been in my graduate program that I've been able to see the two as feeding into one another. But I will say that I have always had, I don't even know if interest would be the correct phrase. I think difficulty would be perhaps a better choice of words to describe my experiences with religion. I grew up, as I'm sure many of us that were raised in the South did. I grew up in the church, and from a pretty young age, I had quite a bit of religious ambivalence. I had a lot of questions that couldn't be answered. I saw issues that were not directly addressed within the church. And as I grew up and went into middle school, particularly high school, I found myself on this religious journey of sorts, or lack thereof, where I was falling away from the religious opinions that I grew to have earlier in my life. And one of the first things that really drew me to modernism when I was taking that British literature class that I mentioned, reading The Wasteland, was T.S. Eliot's depiction of religious life in Britain at the time. And I was able to track the loss of faith in modern society, the rise of secularization, and at the time, I did feel some amount of solace in that as somebody who was stepping away from a religious background. And I felt that if these great writers that I admired, T.S. Eliot, I guess, wouldn't be a case in point here because he was affiliated with the Anglican Church, and The Wasteland is really documenting his criticism of religious decline, among other things. But I was able to see, I guess, from at least a broader perspective that it wasn't just me that was experiencing this like religious ambivalence. It was in the context of The Wasteland, like British society at large. And within the modern period, I then turned to other poets, specifically Wallace Stevens and Philip Larkin, who similarly experienced these like crises of faith, you might say. And I felt a certain amount of comfort in that I wasn't the only person that was experiencing this. Within my undergraduate studies, I took an interest in secularization, and it was only in my graduate studies that I reevaluated the way that I was thinking about religious influence and religious experience. Dorothy and I have talked about there is certainly within Western society, there is this claim of secularization that is a product of Western rationalism and the Enlightenment, the suggestion that religious faith continues to decline, and we expected that at a certain point nobody would be religious anymore. And as we know, that is certainly not the case in contemporary times. While it is the case that fewer people are overtly religious or categorize themselves in accordance with a particular religious denomination, a great percentage of people do identify themselves as spiritual. And so that to me suggests that there is a continuation of religious or spiritual influence in contemporary times. And even tracing back through the modern period and earlier, we continue to see these religious influences, and they're not easily explained away through secularization. So in my undergraduate program, I did focus on secularization and tracking the ways in which all of these modern writers and poets experience these crises of faith. But as I was beginning my graduate studies, I was particularly influenced by a few thinkers, most notably Jürgen Habermas, who writes about postsecularism. Postsecularism is just this idea that we are in an age that is returning to religious values, returning to religious influence. And the term post-secularization is a fraught term in and of itself because it suggests that we have come from a time of secularization where nobody was religious or fewer people were religious, and post-secular suggests that we have moved past that point. And many scholars within the field of religion and literature or religious studies generally reject that hypothesis. They suggest that we have always been religious, or maybe in our contemporary time, it would be more fitting to say we've always been spiritual. We have always had some capacity or interest in some sort of transcendent experience, whether that be associated with a particular deity or an institutional religious tradition, or whether it be what we see more commonly now, which is spiritual experiences that are more individualized and that are not necessarily associated with a particular tradition or denomination. And so as I continued on in my studies, I started to reckon with some of these poets, some of these writers that were just radically reconceptualizing the way that they approached faith. T.S. Eliot certainly is a case of someone who continued to be religious throughout their lives. Wallace Stevens is reported on his deathbed to have converted to Catholicism. That's an interesting conversation in and of itself. But it certainly suggests that within modernism, there is this continual grappling with religious experience and wanting to connect with something beyond ourselves and have a transcendent experience. So as we continue throughout the 20th century, we see different writers engaging with religious traditions of various sorts. Many of the beats are associated with Buddhism, for instance, or more interestingly, the syncretic mix between Christianity and Buddhism. We see that in the work of Jack Kerouac, for instance. And once again, this sort of suggests that writers are continually engaging with these more existential questions of belief, belonging, and meaning. They are just moving to do so in different ways than perhaps they did historically. All of this to say, though, I do think that there is a strong connection between religion and literature, and specifically poetry and religion. Maybe that's a separate conversation that we want to have, some of the connections that we can see between those two things. But I do think that as a researcher, I have developed to reconsidering the way that I had initially approached religion, where I was certainly just interested in tracking secularization, but really the literature has led me to this like post-secular move, where I see that this renewed religious interest is more accurately depicting modern and contemporary religious experience.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there, Taylor.
That was a long-winded answer.
Yeah,
Forgive me.
No, that was brilliant. That was exceptional. So, initially, when you started speaking, one of the things I was thinking about was my research is about Hindu nationalism and thinking about secularization in India. And it seems to me that the way it has happened, probably in the West, specifically talking to you, over a period of time, I have felt that it seems like God itself has been secularized to some extent. Like you remove the structured religious means and make it private, and that sort of privatization of religion is what secularism is all about. And the interesting bit is that I think in this post-secular turn of life, we are constantly engaging in religion at a public level and the kind of politics that is happening. And if anybody knows Taylor, she repeatedly mentions this, that she's not a confrontational person, that she's always just, she does not want to debate about things. But Taylor, you have chosen a topic of study that is so controversial.
It is controversial, yeah. And
I got you on that one.
I would say certainly in our political moment, we do see religious fundamentalism being politicized and weaponized in a variety of harmful ways. And something that I always want to acknowledge when I'm discussing religion and literature is the very real material realities of religious oppression. I don't want to divorce myself from that context. Even today, we continue to see religious extremists, even in Western context, continue to shape political life. So that being said, I think that, as you're saying, Siddharth, secularism has never worked as a political project, for better or for worse. And something that I will say is that I think that these larger systems of like political and religious life can be harmful, especially when we're dealing with marginalized communities. But something that my research concerns now is how religious systems can be used in order to resist oppression from some of these like dominant political forces, even within Judeo-Christianity, and how like certain religious practices, specifically in marginalized communities, can be a way to assert sovereignty. So a project that I have recently been working on deals with the spiritual practices of Puebloan peoples in New Mexico. I actually had the opportunity to do a wonderful summer seminar course with Dr. Ryan Schlesinger in Taos, New Mexico. And during that trip, we had the opportunity to visit Taos Pueblo and learn a little bit about some of the spiritual practices of Taos Puebloan people. And from that experience, I was really able to see how these religious practices are a way for Taos Puebloan people to assert their sovereignty. And we see this in this specific context throughout the specifically 17th century as colonial rule was introduced into the Pueblos and there were forced conversions to Catholicism. These spiritual practices, specifically, I'm concentrating on one spiritual figure who was used as a way to resist colonial religious influence and assert the continuation of the Pueblo spiritual practices. And so in that way, I do see religion or spirituality having some generative potential. Again, I don't want to not recognize the very real histories of oppression that religious systems like Judeo-Christianity have been implicated in. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think that other religious traditions and perhaps even some slants of Judeo-Christianity could have some more generative potential.
That is so interesting because I understand your point and I do agree with you to a certain extent, but it also appears to me that at some point when populism takes over religion and uses it and instrumentalizes it, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate that generative potential from the actual populist narrative. So, like, an oppressed community, how would their religious beliefs, it could be minor forms of subversion, but it seems very hard that how would they be able to separate themselves from this kind of populist movement, specifically in this kind of technosphere that we live in. So what do you think about that? Do you think is it possible to have that generative potential? And if so, then how would we navigate it?
Yeah. Certainly, I will say we are never divorced from the larger cultural context that we're operating within, and that inherently includes the dominant religious tradition. However, I think that it is important to denote the fact that even like a minor form of resistance is a form of resistance, and that is important and that's powerful.
Oh, yeah.
And I think even within a literary context, when we have religious practitioners of a variety of traditions speak about those traditions, bring life to them, I think that's important and that matters.
Oh, yeah.
And so I definitely think that it's like a complex interaction that's happening. These systems of oppression continue, but there are modes in which resistance happens. And I think that literature is one of the dominant ways that happens. So I think that those narratives are important to discuss, and they're important to keep in our collective imaginary. An area of interest that I would like to explore in the coming months is religious traditions, like in a transnational context.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm becoming increasingly interested in religious practices throughout the globe, but specifically within Africa and the diaspora, and how
The
those.
American diaspora?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so how religious practices within these communities, which are they typically involve some use of like physical space, like sacred places, both within nature and constructed spaces, how those spaces do provide a physical resistance
Yeah.
to colonialism, to imperialism. And so I continue to be interested in this conversation about religion, not from only a Western context, but increasingly a global context. I'm interested in global modernism. We know that modernism is not specific or limited to Western traditions, and there's more and more scholarship that is being generated that discusses modernism in transnational contexts, which I think is very important when it comes to religion and literature, because in Western contexts, we have a very different conception of what religion is and what its function is and what secularism is, its function. And the secularization thesis that we in the West have proposed since the Enlightenment on, that proposition does not cohere to other areas of the world in which religious life continues to be an important presence in both personal and political contexts. And so I think that's another important dimension to keep in mind when we're discussing secularization. The idea of secularization is an inherently Western conception.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think if we want to truly and accurately depict religious experience in the modern world, we, of course, have to go beyond the West and see that the rest of the world, a majority of the world, conceives of religious life differently. And I think that should call into question important discussions about the role of religion, the role of politics, etc.
I want to hang on here for a second on religion and literature, because I think that's very fascinating to see how the two play out, because they have such a huge history and you've mentioned a lot of it. But what do you think is like the driving force somewhere between this poetry is such a different art form from a novel, and specifically I'm thinking about performance poetry is more of a public act than writing poetry, and religion can also be private and public. Similarly, like a novel is more of a private act of reading, but it is distributed more globally. So I wonder, what do you mean when you start to think about literature? That's something that is very interesting to me, and its relationship with religion and secularism. And I know you have mentioned it, but is there something about the formal elements of poetry that you've been trying to get to, I think?
Yeah, you've certainly raised an important distinction here between the private creation of literature and then the public dissemination of that literature, which mean we can see the parallels in religious life. Religion, at least conceptually, is a personal, perhaps private practice, but the communal element is what really creates its broader significance. And arguably, when we talk about literature, there is a personal dimension and there's generative potential in just writing literature for oneself, but then sharing that literature, of course, increases the spread of whatever is being talked about. So the public and private distinction, I think, is notable. When it comes to poetry in particular, this is the area that I am most familiar with and where the majority of my research lies. I think that there are many parallels between poetry and religion. I think that both are, at least conceptually, they involve like a sort of practice. You practice poetry, you practice a religion. They're both involved in something that you do rather than something that you just believe. I think that there's a certain ritual that's involved in poetry that you might say is also involved in religion. I know that there are many poets who take part in some sort of ritual as they are creating poetry. I'm specifically thinking of a poet called C.A. Conrad. If you're familiar with this poet?
Never heard.
Okay, so C.A. Conrad is a somatic poet, and they engage in a lot of very interesting rituals prior to or during the act of writing poetry. They're specifically interested in like creating sensory experiences for themselves in order to serve as like an impetus for writing poetry.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so some different things that they've partaken in. I believe that one day they went to a park and laid down and immersed themselves in like the sounds of the park, of like little bugs like crawling across their skin, really internalizing the sensory like somatic experience and then using that as a way to write poetry. Another example is they will like frequently take part in fasts, or they will limit themselves to a particular diet as a way to inspire poetry. So yeah, there's this like certain ritual element that's involved in C.A. Conrad's poetry that I think we can certainly see in religious ritual as well. And so when we think about it in that capacity, I feel like there is quite a bit of overlap. There's the personal and the communal dimension of both. There's the practice of both. There's the ritual that is inherent in that practice. And then I think ultimately what poets are seeking to do and what religious practitioners are seeking to do is experience something transcendent beyond themselves. And I think that these are just two different mediums in order to accomplish that. I know Wallace Stevens, for instance, underwent in his religious journey a variety of what he deemed to be alternatives to God when he ultimately decided that he was no longer religious and that the idea of God as such no longer made sense in the modern world. He took part in like several quests in order to find alternatives. And you see this all throughout literary history, but he explored aestheticism, he explored humanism, all as a means to connect with something higher than himself, to have this transcendent experience. And that way, I think, again, that poetry is just one vehicle to connect with something greater than oneself, in the same way that a deity, a god, a particular belief or conception of the world is a way of having that transcendent moment.
Yeah. Okay, you've given some really nice answers today, but that might just be my favorite one.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was thinking about so many things when you were talking about religion. In particular, like what interests me the most is I was thinking about how, as you said, like they have religion and poetry are very similar. And like there's some kind of delocalization that happens. Like we are moving outside of the spatial and temporal constraints that we live in. And that's like the transcendental moment that happens. And poetry also uses like metaphors and imagery, and it seems like religious fantasy is also built on similar ideas, and it seems there's something deeply interconnected, and I love that you got me to think about that.
Thanks. Yeah, even just from like a structural perspective, I'm just taking the Bible as a case in point because that's the book that I'm most familiar with growing up in a Christian household. But the Bible, as a literary document, there's poetry within it. There are parables. There are narratives. So I think that it's not a far stretch at all to connect poetry and connect religion. I think that they are inextricably related, and I think that it's very useful for us to consider them side by side.
Oh yeah, totally. Another thing that I want to ask you is that since you're a poet, would you like to tell us something about your own poetry?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I really feel like my critical work is informed by my creative work. I turned to poetry not until I was an undergrad. Prior to that, I had been writing short stories, but I really found within poetry a new sort of medium to express myself that I couldn't experience through writing short stories or writing novels. Also, there's just a very practical issue of it doesn't take, at least for me, it doesn't take me as long to write a poem as it does to write a long story. And so there's something like rewarding about having a piece that you've created that's finished that you can hold in your hands. And so I found poetry rewarding in that aspect as well. But yeah, when I came to do my first creative writing class, it was a similar thing to what I was saying earlier about teaching and researching. It's like just because you're good at researching doesn't mean you'll be good at teaching. And so my perspective was just because I am good at researching, I don't know if I'm going to be good at creative work. And so I went into it like quite vulnerably, but I really loved the experience. I had a wonderful professor that taught creative writing, and I ended up taking like several semesters with her. I did my undergrad capstone on, I did a creative project for that. I did a poetry chapbook. And so I really enjoyed that.
Oh, I want to read that.
Oh, I actually did print out some physical copies. Like I created like a little book.
Yeah, I want to read that.
I printed off like 20 copies to hand out to people at my capstone, and then I got too nervous about it and I didn't give them to anybody. So I just have like several copies of
You owe me a copy.
of this collection on my bookshelf at home. But yeah, there's something very nerve-wracking, vulnerable to put yourself out there and have other people read it.
Yeah.
Something I did want to hit on is that at OSU, I had the opportunity last semester to take a poetry workshop with Dr. Lisa Lewis, and that was a wonderful experience for me. I find, from what I've heard at least in other departments, maybe there isn't as much opportunity to collaborate between different programs. It's not often that a literature student would be able to take a creative writing workshop. And so I was very grateful and very humbled that Dr. Lewis allowed me to go into her class and take part in the workshop. And that was a great experience for me. It really got me back into the swing of things with poetry and really influenced my craft. The class was themed around political poetry, and so much of my work considers intersections between religion and politics. And so it was really wonderful having that political foregrounding for like poetic work to inform both my creative work and my critical work. And so all of that being said, I feel like my poetry is probably similar to my research in that I'm considering the same questions in different ways. I'm really concerned in my poetry with these same existential questions. What is God? Who am I? How do I make meaning of my life? And I have used both mediums as a means to explore those questions. Yeah, I would find myself in the workshop every week trying to write about something like more overtly political, and then almost always I would just have some like angsty poem about trying to figure out God and trying to figure out like my identity. And I see now that that practice does inform my critical work as well, but it really points to the fact that this area of focus is like not just a scholarly pursuit for me, but this is like an ongoing quest for me as a person. And so I feel very grateful that I've been able to explore that in a professional context as a graduate student, and then hopefully later in academia. And yeah, all of that being said, poetry rocks. I love poetry. Often I think when I'm having a hard day doing my literary criticism, I think, oh, I should just be a poet instead. Yeah, I know you probably feel similarly about it as someone who writes poetry yourself.
Oh, yeah. I absolutely love poetry. Oh, my God. I do love the idea of engaging with different forms. I don't want to be restricted to any form, but it's just like poetry is this, like, the foundation of it for me. It's just the best experience of life.
Yeah, I don't think we've discussed this. Who are some of your favorite poets?
Oh my God. Oh, wow. We are really gonna turn the tables here.
Yeah.
Oh, you
You
put
are
me on
n-
spot here,
you
huh?
are now the interviewee.
Oh my
Please
God.
tell us, Siddharth,
Oh,
your poetic influences.
my favorite poets. Okay, I think stylistically, Hopkins was very influential. I think I absolutely loved T.S. Eliot, and I know there are people who don't, but yeah, Proof Rock is just one of my all-time favorite poems.
T.S. Eliot does get a bad rap in some respects
Yeah.
for good reason, but
Yeah.
I similarly, I've not been influenced by any poet more than T.S. Eliot, so.
Yeah, I feel that. And then another very controversial poet that I absolutely loved reading was Ted Hughes. I know Ted Hughes is quite problematic, and I also love Sylvia Plath. It's like the it just breaks ground on so many levels. And in contemporary poetry, I am very much influenced by an Indian poet named Meena Kandasamy. Oh my God, her work. When the first time I read her work, I felt like I was chewing fire.
Wow.
It was
That's a
stunning.
wonderful description.
Yeah.
Does she have collections?
Oh yeah, she has multiple collections. She's a prize-winning author, and she's absolutely amazing, brilliant, very revolutionary, and very politically active. So I think like I can see my transition in that sense. Yeah, it's been really nice to uncover that side of poetry. And then there's so many poets. Oh my God. There is like a poet in Urdu who writes, his name is Amir Aziz. He wrote a poem that I absolutely loved. It was a protest poem against the citizenship law that came out in India a few years back. And that was amazing. And then there's just so many poets. There's no one poet that I can name, but
Yeah.
yeah, they all have their own charm. I also loved Coleridge.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you definitely have a great range of different poets. And similarly, I feel like there are some poets that I connect with stylistically. There's a contemporary poet named Catherine Merwin who I love. I would love to write poetry in the same way that she does. It's so lyrical and so beautiful. Sometimes I struggle to capture what's happening on a literal level. The language is so compelling to me that it doesn't even matter. But yeah, there are some poets like Catherine Merwin that stylistically I love, and then others that just the content, the things that they're discussing really resonate with me. Usually these are in the vein of like religious poets. Marie Howe is influential to me. I did a research project about the poet Jean Toomer. I don't know if you're familiar with his
No.
work. He primarily is well known for his hybrid work, Cain, but he has had very little critical reception in like his later works, which is primarily like religious poetry. But yeah, I similarly feel like there's a wide range of different poets and different periods that inform my poetry and just that I like to read for fun.
Oh yeah, we can just talk about poetry.
Yeah, we'll be here all day.
Yeah, one of the things I absolutely love about poetry is that it's not formulaic. Like I know a lot of poetry is. People are just like, okay, you have to write like this form, and I'm going to use these many syllables, or this would be the meter, and that's how I'm going to
Yeah.
make imagery. But I absolutely love when poets are just like, fuck it, and I'm gonna just do what I do. I don't care. I'm gonna just write the way it organically comes. And I think just to have that space to be able to be poet, to produce poetry, yet be like fuck it. That's I think the best space for me.
Yeah, for sure. I have had several attempts of writing in particular forms, and I enjoy it as a practice. But when I'm writing my own work and like trying to be creative, I certainly resonate with the free verse. So
Yeah, free verse is all.
yeah, free verse
Yeah.
or die.
That's funny. Okay, so I have another question for you, which I am interested in asking is you are also the chair of Southern Plains Conference, which is on April 25th and 26th this year.
It is.
How are you feeling about it? And do you want to tell us something about the conference?
Yes, I would love to. So I am on the Southern Plains Graduate Advisory Board, or is it just Advisory Board? I don't think the graduate's in the title.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I'm on the advisory board. Siddharth and I are both on the advisory board. He's done so much for the conference. You're so involved in everything, and you do a great job. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're doing great job.
Thanks. I feel like you do all of the heavy lifting. I'm just like, there, I show up. So.
No, that's not true. Taylor is being modest here. Let me tell you, she's being very modest. Everything that she has done, she's exceptional at it.
Oh my gosh, as are you. But yeah, we've actually gotten to collaborate on like most everything, the conference together. So that's been really cool. But yeah, speaking to the conference, it's on April 25th and 26th at West Watkins Center. The theme is Wonder Unbound, and I am very excited about that theme. I know we've had many discussions while trying to come up with the conference theme, but wonder as an affect interests me because I think that there are so many different dimensions to it. Of course, there's like the more commonly discussed side of wonder where we're dealing with curiosity and wonder as like an impetus for knowledge, which is great. But I think also that there's another dimension of wonder where wonder can be essentially like an othering affect. It creates a sort of
exoticized
yes,
version?
exactly.
Yeah.
Fetishization, exoticization. And I think that in and of itself can be like quite harmful. I think wonder like inherently is spectacular. And so I think that there are just like so many different dimensions of it, and it's not really an affect that's explored all that much that I'm able to find at least.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
Yeah, and so I think that there's so many different applications to wonder, so I'm glad that we're exploring it as a theme. But yeah, it's been really great working on the advisory board. I will say that Southern Plains was the first conference that I ever presented at. Again, Siddharth and I were on a panel together, which was a great panel. Siddharth came up with the idea, and it was such a good idea that we won a... Yes! I forgot we had the buttons. Yeah, Siddharth organized the panel, and we won an award for, like, most theme-relevant panel. That was the first conference that I presented at, and I really loved the experience. I felt that it was very accessible. It was very collaborative. I appreciated the opportunity to go and see different colleagues presenting and connect with scholars from other institutions as well. I feel as an incoming graduate student, the idea of conferences were very intimidating to me. But Southern Plains was like so welcoming that I was not nervous at all whatsoever, and it was a really great experience. So I was happy to have the opportunity to be on the advisory committee this year, and I am really looking forward to the conference. And if you have not registered for the conference, if you're not presenting at the conference, I would still really recommend that you register for the conference and come as an attendee, or you can come as a moderator. We're looking for people to moderate the sessions. But it's a great way to familiarize yourself with conferences. I know now as somebody who has since gone on to present at other conferences, Southern Plains is just a great place to get started, and I feel so much more well prepared to present at regional, national conferences. So it's going to be a great time. Would recommend anybody to come regardless of whether you're presenting or you'd like to moderate or just sit in. I think it'll be great.
Thank you. Yeah, Southern Plains is such an exciting opportunity, and I'm so happy that I have been involved in it in so much organizational detail. It's been really fascinating. Taylor, the next question I have for you is what we ask everybody. What's next for you as a researcher, as a teacher, as a poet, and as a person?
Yeah, so this is always a loaded question. I'm trying to figure out what's coming next myself. As of right now, I'm finishing my thesis portfolio, and I, fingers crossed, will be graduating in May. So hopefully that comes to pass. I will then be attending a PhD program in the fall, and hopefully...
Have you decided at a university?
I have not.
You knew I would ask you that.
Yeah, I have not. I have to decide by March 15th, or April 15th. I've had a couple of campus visits. I definitely want to visit everywhere before I make any decisions, but I'm really excited about it. I feel like very well prepared going into a PhD program thanks to OSU. So very excited about it. Definitely plan to continue working with the professional organizations that I'm involved in, mostly Modernist Studies Association. And then hopefully wherever I go next, I'll similarly have the opportunity to be involved on campus and different organizations. And yeah, really looking forward to it.
Thank you. So it was great having you here, and I'm very excited for you, and I'm sure you're going to do amazing wherever you go, and you're going to have a great career, and we'll be friends, and we'll keep chatting about these things. So, yeah, thank you everybody for watching. See you next time.
Woo!
You want to say something at the end?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was a really great conversation, and I am looking forward to seeing whatever you do next. I know you'll do awesome as well. Can we click our button, the exciting
sound?
music?
Oh, yeah, sound. Sure.
Yeah. Woo! And subscribe.
And subscribe. Share the video, please. Bye.